Well, hello and welcome to the Order of Unmanageable Risks. This is a podcast about capitalism and anxiety. My name is Aris Komporozos Athanasiou, and I teach sociology at University College London.
And my name is Max Haven. I am Canada Research Chair in Culture, Media and Social Justice at Lakehead University and co-director of the Reimagining Value Action Lab. On this podcast, we talk to specialists in a whole variety of fields about the links between capitalism and anxiety. We want to move beyond the medicalized definition of anxiety as something that just affects individuals, and also talk about it as something that's affecting society and that's intimately connected to the economy as a whole, specifically the capitalist economy. This project is part of the Common Anxieties Research Project, which you can discover more about at anxious.community. And it's supported by the Institute for Advanced Studies at the University College London and the Reimagining Value Action Lab.
Cool. So let me introduce our first guest today, James Bridle. So James is a writer and artist working across technologies and disciplines. Their artworks have been commissioned by galleries and institutions and exhibited worldwide and on the internet. Their writing on literature, culture, and networks has appeared in magazines and newspapers, including Wired, The Atlantic, New Statesman, The Guardian, and The Observer. And New Dark Age, which the recent book, which we will be discussing today, about technology, knowledge, and the end of the future, no less, was published by Verso in 2018. Last year, James also wrote and presented New Ways of Seeing for BBC Radio 4, and which was a show about the politics of visibility and invisibility in our technologically augmented world, something that we will be returning to and discuss today as well, hopefully. So just let me say a few brief words about how I came to know about James's work, and I have to say I came quite sort of late to their work that was through the book, through New Dark Age, which I thought it was very pertinent and relevant to the types of concerns and anxieties about the politics of finance capitalism, which is the kind of field that Max and I have been working on over the last couple of years, especially the ways in which James talks about opacity, invisibility, uncertainty, and how these qualities relate to my understanding and our understanding of the way finance capitalism becomes resilient in spite of all the crisis that it has been going through in the last few years. So I thought that I'm particularly excited to speak with James because I thought that something that they're doing is articulating those kind of issues in a very clear and powerful way, and that goes beyond the usual approaches of technophobia and technophilia, which we see a lot in kind of writing that looks at the role of technology in those issues. And personally, I kind of worked my way backwards towards James's essays and artwork as part of the New Aesthetic, which was a big project that sparked huge debate in the early 2010s. You know, most of my friends were already kind of in the know about this. I came a bit late, but essentially it was James's concern about this question of illegibility of new digital technologies and our kind of networked world, and their concern about finding new ways of representing those illegibilities and formulating a critique out of those. If I'm making justice to your work, James. So I was eager to talk to James today because I think, and I'm coming to the end of this, but I think their work plays rather playfully with something that at first level seems paradoxical, but captures so powerfully our contemporary moment and our predicament in this kind of COVID era right now as well, which is how in our attempts to understand our increasingly complex and uncertain world, we're actually make it even more incomprehensible, and that shows across many different levels of our life, from science and our ability to forecast the weather, or forecast how the epidemic current epidemic might develop, to our ability to our politics and our ability to understand the kind of political developments of our time, from the kind of populism we get, the kind of post-Brexit era, and what things might look like. So I think there's something I'm really fascinated to talk to James more about, how this unarticulated and hidden role of technologies in all this kind of process of this complexity of the world around us, how we can understanding also in terms of opening maybe new vistas for formulating critique and responding to the challenges that we're faced with right now. So I'll leave it here. That was just to give you a bit of a taste of what I sort of find interesting in your work, James, and perhaps we can just jump right to some parts of the book that I thought kind of capture some of these questions quite nicely, and ask you to talk to us a bit about, unpack those a bit more for us. Does that sound okay?
Yeah, well, thanks very much for having me, and happy to discuss them.
Excellent. So I guess even before I do that, I mean, can I just ask with a more sort of personal question to do also with the current moment? How does the current state of capitalism make you feel, and does it cause any kind of anxiety to you right now?
As much as it ever did. I mean, your focus on the focus of your work on this podcast is around capitalism, and it's interesting because I've been talking about this book and this work, but particularly the way the work is formulated in the book, for a couple of years now, and it's pretty common that that I'll get asked, essentially, when I'm talking about what I talk about. People will go, "Aren't you just talking about capitalism?" Because there's so much of the examples that I use in the book and the things that I work with generally are deeply intertwined with capitalism. But on the other hand, I don't consider myself any kind of expert or scholar of capitalism itself. And actually, it's not really the way that I tend to frame things. But I also, I guess I envisage it very much as the kind of overall structuring of a lot of what I'm discussing. But I kind of see the events I'm focusing on as things that happen kind of within capitalism, sometimes to support it, sometimes in opposition of it. That really, I have no personal feeling of grip or grasp on capitalism, which maybe is something that you're kind of talking about. I don't really know yet in terms of this kind of feelings of anxiety, but capitalism being the condition, the weather, a huge overarching structure that I feel I'm really kind of poking at the edges of. So I tend to think of capitalism as something that is there, that exists, is happening, and sometimes it's very specific, like sort of points into my life or our lives, but it's not the thing that I'm necessarily directly concerned with. But that might be also a kind of blindness on my part.
Well, I think it really is. There's something there about these questions of opacity and complexity that you really kind of grapple with in your work, and these are very much embedded in this kind of, especially the new forms of capitalism. So I think, if anything, it's quite interesting the kind of openings you offer through your work to kind of even a language to speak about those complexities, actually. And I think, what's interesting is that I think we quite need that from outside, let's say, traditional political economy type of studies of capitalism.
Well, I mean, one thing that I found happens, and this has happened sort of multiple times in my own work, and not entirely consciously, it's something that I've sort of realized is happening, is that I focus on, particular things, particular frameworks, particular events, particularly technological ones. And because those are not terribly well theorized, either because they're very novel, though this is not to discount a huge history of science and technology theory and all this kind of stuff, but the things, apparently, some of the things I talk about have not been spoken of in this way before. And the way that I speak about them provides, as you say, a certain kind of terminology for understanding wider effects. And in that, I think it's very closely related to what I was just saying about these things being embedded within, but also kind of like holographic fragments of capitalism. If we think of technology as something that is often a kind of unconscious embodiment of certain politics, of certain ways of thinking and ways of seeing the world. Those ways of thinking, ways of seeing become kind of embodied into technologies. And then if you critique the technologies, you kind of build up a framework that you realize actually opens up a much wider view of what's going on. And that's kind of how I tend to think about these things. That, yes, particularly that I will start, if we're talking about opacity, for a long time, I've spoken about the ways in which technology kind of hides itself away. And that's a result of several factors, but in particular, it's a design thing. Right, so the way most consumer technologies are designed today, they're designed to abstract away what's actually happening. That's the working of the thing, the running of the code, but also all of the power relationships and the money that's like embedded into these things. And so, and when you embed that all into like a smartphone, and you can show people the black glass of a smartphone and understand literally this as a black box that is deliberately hiding things away, that's a really powerful way of introducing people to the notion of kind of black box closed systems that are black boxes for multiple reasons, because they are technologically complex and there is a difficulty in understanding them, but also because of business interest, because of political interest that want to keep them hidden to some extent. And also to our own general blindness and unwillingness to really investigate the things that we encounter every day.
Yeah, no, this is really interesting, and it's actually a great way to move to the first quote from the book that I'm going to read out loud, and I'll ask you to sort of unpack this a little bit more for us. And it is precisely a passage that I think makes a similar point to what you just mentioned now in relation to how technologies and the question of technology and power, and specifically through this issue of compounded opacity and complexity that new technology and computational technologies in particular sort of bring in. So here's the passage. There is a concrete and causal relationship between the complexity of the systems we encounter every day, the opacity with which most of these systems are constructed or described, and fundamental global issues of inequality, violence, populism, and fundamentalism. And it's I've put this. There's another, and I want to bring also another short passage, which is about computation in particular, because I think this is just to make it clear what we mean by technology. And I think computational technology is what you really sort of so nicely unpack in your book. So computation, you write, is opaque. It takes place inside the machine, behind the screen, in remote buildings, within, as it were, a cloud. Even when this opacity is penetrated by direct apprehension of code and data, it remains beyond the comprehension of most. The aggregation of complex systems in contemporary networked applications means that no single person ever sees the whole picture. And I guess what I want to sort of ask you, taking cue from these passages, is if you could tell us a little bit more about what we see here. I think is this question of the cloud and what is hidden within the cloud and what is visible. So this question of what is presented to us as visible and what remains invisible. And so who is able to see and who is able to not see is a question of power, right? So and this is something that you've discussed a lot in your Radio 4 show as well. So I guess I want to probe that a bit more in relation to the current forms of inequality that we're faced with, and how you see this question of technology, visibility and invisibility impacting on those on today's inequalities.
Yeah. So I mean, to unpack that quote a little bit. I'm talking about the fact that these two central things, which are complexity and opacity, are the two kind of main ways in which contemporary networked computational technologies kind of are present in the world. They're incredibly complex. As I say, no one has the full picture really of the kind of interaction of all these different systems. And partly that's an effect of scale and complexity. It's just impossible to hold all this in an individual head. No human is capable of it. But there's also a deliberate obscuring of it, which takes place for multiple reasons. If you're talking about like a nation state doing surveillance, there's a state security governmental reason for doing it. There's also like simple business reasons for doing it. Like if you make a thing simpler, more people use it. Like that's not automatically evil, let's say, though I would say it has certain terrible outcomes. The combination of those two things produces, I think, these larger issues which I'm talking about. And again, maybe we can kind of pair them up. When I'm talking about these what I call global issues of inequality and violence, essentially, I'm talking about the power relationships that are embedded in those different levels of knowledge. Because if some people understand how a thing works, and a bunch of other people don't understand how that thing works, the people who understand have more power. And as soon as you have a power inequality, some form of violence always results. That's just what happens when you have an imbalance in relationships. There's going to be some advantage being taken in some direction. And that violence can be financial, or it can be literal, it can take all kinds of forms. But the violence is a product of that inequality, and that inequality starts with an imbalance in knowledge and understanding that allows one group to have an advantage over the other. And black box technologies, whether that's deliberately little shiny boxes or just complex, difficult to understand things, really accentuate that inequality. The result that's happening, that's also embedded in there on the other side, I feel very strongly, is what in that quote I call populism and fundamentalism. This is really a point from where the book started from, which was to say, like, how come after 50 years of incredibly accelerating technologies of incredible sophistication, and the dream of technology that it improves lives, how do we find ourselves in the present time looking at a global political landscape that's comprised of so much violence, fundamentalism, nationalism, these kind of concerns, which really should be the opposite of what we should be seeing if everything we thought about these technologies was true. And there's several things going on there, but to relate it to the opacity, I think the really important thing is to understand that fundamentally we believe in the ability of technology to do certain things and to produce certain equalities. And so when it doesn't, that really sets up a huge cognitive dissonance for us. But we believe we should understand the world, that we have these technologies for control of the world. And so either they're not working, or some shadowy power, or some power we can actually point at, is pulling the levers, right? And we feel the opposite of empowered by these technologies. These technologies continually produce a deep and profound sense of disempowerment, which we're not always conscious of. And this is where the kind of theorizing comes in, because people don't necessarily go around feeling or aware that they're feeling disempowered all the time. But if you can't switch on the news and see people spouting the most insane conspiracy theories without thinking that there is an attempt here to say that we can assert a narrative over things that are outside of our control. And for me, that's deeply related to the way technology promises power and then continually kind of removes it and hides it away, and actually makes it harder for us to really understand the way the world around us is working.
James, can I ask you, because you mentioned conspiracy, and I think that's a really that's something that I found really fascinating in the way it was one of those aspects of one of the observations that you make in the book that I thought are really interesting, in terms of how some of the political responses to to this environment, this kind of technological environment that, reality that we're all experiencing, some of those responses that we see in contemporary populist movements, like, the kind of regressive, nativist, neo-fascist populist movements, seem to be doing maybe, and correct me if I'm wrong, because this is something I want to ask you, seem to be doing something maybe quite effectively in the way they understand how to navigate that kind of cloud, and the way they provide, the kind of narratives they provide for people to navigate those kind of complexities. And I kind of, if you don't mind, I want to read another passage that speaks to that issue and ask you to talk to us a little bit more about it. So you write, faced with the rolling tide of information, we attempt to gain some kind of control over the world by telling stories about it. We attempt to master it through narratives. These narratives are inherently simplifications, because no one story can account for everything that is happening. The world is too complex for simple stories. Instead of accepting this, the stories become even more baroque and bifurcated, even more convoluted and open-ended. Thus, paranoia in the age of network access produces a feedback loop. The failure to comprehend a complex world leads to the demand for more and more information, which only further clouds our understanding, revealing more and more complexity that must be accounted for by even more Byzantine theories of the world. More information produces not more clarity, but more confusion. And to me, this makes me think a lot about, and you talk in the book also about Twitter bots and the kind of Brexit conspiracy theories and the kind of those kind of regressive narratives that are produced in that chaotic environment. And it makes me think of Dominic Cummings and his kind of references to misfits and chaotic management and all the Surkov kind of dogma in Putin's kind of environment of dealing with that chaos. So I wondered, in the current landscape, and maybe the kind of post-COVID landscape as well, like what these type of uncertainties and complexities, what the implications for, are these populists doing something better in navigating that environment? I mean, is there anything there that you think?
Well, I mean, before we get into the political siding of it, which is absolutely crucial, and like it's really important to emphasize that I don't think conspiracy itself, as a term for this kind of process of either kind of making baroque or making simple stories, as an attempt to understand the world, is itself rooted in one or the other politics. That to me is like a deep, deep human need to, like, it's the disease of having a forebrain, that we need to make sense of the world. And so we construct stories. And we construct stories that make sense to us, that allow us to feel we have some kind of agency over our lives. And at the most extreme forms, control over those lives, which of course is completely unattainable. And that's just a problem we have. And on the other hand, we need stories that also give us a sense of, not just control and agency, but importance, that we're right, that we are seen in a modern parlance, so that we are present in this as ourselves and as individuals. And that's an ongoing process that we're all doing all the time. Where I think, particularly, we see a political difference is that that's fairly well theorized. We understand that. What happens then is when there's a different incentive at play, and my feeling would be that the right has always been more concerned with and aware of the possibility of taking and holding power than the left, which wants to democratize and open up power and kind of explain this to everyone. So I think this stuff is, when you mention someone like Surkov or Cummings, we're talking about people who really do understand this, but they're not trying to make it better. Right? They're not trying to improve the situation. They're trying to use that understanding to take and hold power. So there's two main processes here at work. One of which is like an understanding of this situation and its complexity and what it's doing. And the other thing is who's better at like weaponizing that understanding in order to take and hold political power. And yes, it would definitely appear that not even right and left are really the best terminologies for this, but certainly what I would call more fundamentalist or nativist politics are very, very, very good at weaponizing this, because they are the simplest and oldest stories there are. Like, here is a dogma, here is a race, like here is a line you can walk down that's just clear, even though it's of course never clear, and that allows you to feel that you are correct, you are holding the correct position, and that there is a clear division in the world that you can abide by. And so that way of seeing the world is much more amenable to manipulation by people who have a kind of sophisticated understanding of the kind of complexity and confusions that we're talking about. And that's why I call it a kind of concrete and causal reaction. Like, I think it's solid, and I think it's a result of, in part, of the increased apparent complexity of the world. You know, and this is again why technology is worth emphasizing, because I always try and remember to say the apparent complexity of the world. But the world is complex. The world is not made complex by our technologies, but it appears complex because of the way we receive it and interact with it. And that's why I don't have a lot of truck with the idea of, as I say, of technology making the world itself more complex. But I will squarely put the blame on the way in which we've designed, built, and thought about technologies for the last forever for doing that.
James, to jump in, I wanted to ask you about then the role of the critic, the role of the critical cultural producer, the role of activists in the spheres of media and ideas. What in the way that you framed it, which I think is really illuminating and very useful, it strikes me that a book like yours and a lot of the work that many are trying to do to, in some way, illuminate these dynamics is not then just about sharing the correct information. It's actually about generating some kind of different form of radical, let's say, storytelling, or at least transformative storytelling that can give us different resources to make sense of the world together. Would you agree with that? Do you think that's a fair representation of it?
I mean, yes, I do broadly, but I also think it's eternally insufficient on another level. I think it is the work that needs to be done, and I think that work can take many forms. I don't think it can't and mustn't take the form of telling people that there is a better way of thinking about this stuff, that they're just wrong, or like this is the bringing a fact checker to a knife fight type deal. Like it like the insistence on fact checking and saying this narrative is wrong and this narrative is right. That's not helpful. Not least because it continues to remove agency from the people who are all they're trying to do is find agency within these situations. And so the only way to, like, at the higher scale, shift this situation is to genuinely empower people. Ultimately, and that is ultimately a political project and fundamentally an educational project. Because unless you have personally an agency within the systems you are operating in, then being told that the story is different to the one you think it is, it's just a battle of stories. It makes no fundamental difference. And your actual agency and your perception of your agency are also deeply intertwined. Because people who have perceptions of their own agency actually have agency. Like that's the primary thing here. And this is why, for example, I use technology as an example a lot in teaching, which I don't do a lot of, but I really think is probably the most important thing. I talk a lot about teaching technology as a way of understanding the world. Just as earlier I spoke about theorizing technology as a way of theorizing other things, my personal experience is also that to some extent, I feel I have a slightly better grasp on the world, as good as any of us do, because I know how computers work, right? on certain other levels. And I have a certain understanding of types of complexity and types of engineering and, these knowledges of the domains in which we all live that gives me a feeling of agency, which in turn gives me actual agency. And that doesn't mean that I will fix the world by fixing computers. But it does mean that I hope I'm maybe slightly less terrified of the world, essentially, which is the main inhibitor to people, having agency, having confidence, having critical abilities to make their own decisions about which stories affect, and so on and so forth.
James, and I think this actually again links to the last part of that I wanted to the last sort of question I had for you, and the last short part from the book that I want to read you, and it's actually, it makes me think, because you're talking now about education, and so there's the question of knowledge, and you talk again in the book about I think I can't remember whether you speak about Rumsfeld himself, but you talk about the unknown unknowns, I think, right? And this question of what we don't know and how we deal with that, with those unknown unknowns. And you speak about the cloud ultimately, and the darkness of the cloud. And I think you talk about gray zones. So there is, on the one hand, this education and the need to know, and this kind of quest for the, okay.
Sorry, we're on chat, but you can see that I'm waving kind of agitatedly at this equation of education and knowledge, which is fundamentally flawed. That when I speak about education, I am not speaking about knowledge. I am not speaking about knowing. I am not speaking about teaching as like informing people so that they know things. I'm talking about teaching people so that they can do things. Education is practice, not knowledge imparting. It's muscular, right? It's a skill. It's a process of learning that enables further learning. Because the unknown unknowns, God, I hate that phrase, is not a domain to be conquered, right? This is the fundamental thing. But when I speak of darkness and uncertainty, I do not speak of them as things to be conquered, as things to be illuminated, to be dominated, to be kind of brought into the light, because I don't believe that everything can be known, and that's the fundamental kind of epistemological battle of our time. Is this belief that if we only gather enough data, if we surveil everything, if we do all this, that we'll be able to contain the world into a knowable form and therefore have total power over it. That's the fundamental misunderstanding. And so what that informs is my view that that teaching and education is not about imparting knowledge, right? It's imparting agency. It's giving people the confidence and the skills and the frameworks and the techniques and the processes to make their own knowledges, because knowledge is plural, and it's specific to events and occurrences and phenomena, and it differs in time, and it differs according to ability and background and everything else. And there's no such thing as like universally applicable knowledge. It needs to be constantly regenerated, and it needs to be, and in order to share power and all that kind of stuff, it needs to be generated by as many people as possible. So anytime I'm talking, about education and teaching, it has nothing to do with building knowledge and everything to do with building a kind of critical muscle memory that can then be applied to novel situations.
Yeah, no, thanks for clarifying that. And I think it's a really important distinction to make. And just to kind of bring it into some sort of conclusion, if we can, really, just to stay a little bit, to linger a bit more in that kind of dark space, where this kind of political muscle might be able to flex that, so let me read this quote. I think it's a beautiful passage, and then I'll ask you for some sort of concluding thoughts on that, following on from that. So you write, we have been conditioned to think of the darkness as a place of danger, even of death. But the darkness can also be a place of freedom and possibility, a place of equality. For many, what is discussed here will be obvious because they have always lived in this darkness that seems so threatening to the privileged. We have much to learn about unknowing. Uncertainty can be productive, even sublime. And you talk I'm going to bring another very short one here, where you say cloudy thinking, the embrace of unknowing, might allow us to revert from computational thinking, and it is what the network itself urges upon us. So, yeah, I mean, because I mean, we are in many ways. I mean, increasingly, you know, the darkness is increasingly kind of something that is understood by more and more of us, I think, in the current kind of moment. So, yeah, I just wondered if you wanted to share with us your kind of current thoughts about these conclusions. This is part of your conclusions from the book.
I have to say, I don't think there's much more to say about that than what I've said. You know, thank you for reading the quote. I don't particularly have much to add to that sentiment. I mean, it very much comes from a perspective of being constantly aware that I speak from a place of immense privilege. And whenever any of us, particularly in the West, start talking about like, oh, you know, there's this kind of, you know, existential risks of uncertainty, there's a fairly strong case to be made that we've, you know, just noticed what life is like for the other 99% of humanity. And so when I say that like other people have always lived in the dark, it's to acknowledge that you know, there's very different experiences of this. That said, you know, most can only speak from one's own experience. And I also believe in as I say there, quite simply, in the darkness as a place of freedom. You know, in whatever form that darkness may take for me or for you or for anyone else, that the ability to explore for oneself without fear of oversight, of surveillance, of all these kind of things is absolutely critical to the self, and that's you know, this is a problem of contemporary life, that we lack certain kinds of freedom, and it's something that the political forces on both sides are struggling with, in terms of whether that's social control or whether it's kind of forms of identity politics, which is not to critique identity politics, it's to say that is an issue it has in terms of the ability to explore and think clearly. But also that it's sublime, that I really, really mean this, that for me, uncertainty is the most beautiful thing. You know, you talk to like quantum physicists and get them to talk about how little they understand and how incredibly amazing that is, that the world remains this kind of open field of play and possibility. Like, I don't want to live in this like brightly lit room where everything is illuminated and clear and immobile and dead. The darkness is the place where all forms of possibility, social and political, like remain in existence and imminent. And the idea that we would deliberately kind of try and coalesce them into something that we know explicitly is just not how I want to live. So it took a long time to kind of realize that for myself in writing about this darkness, that actually I constantly use throughout the book, in particular the figure of darkness as something bad, but I don't really mean that it's bad. It's a condition that most of the badness, terrible way of phrasing it, but the badness of the world emerges from our attempt to kind of conquer the darkness, really, rather than learning about how to live with it. And the project, therefore, is how to live fully and equitably and with justice in the presence of darkness, rather than in denial of it.
So that thanks for this, James. I mean, I think that's I really agree with this, and I think with this, I think it's time we're coming to the end of this, and what I want to say is really that I think your work and the book itself, you know, it's even more relevant right now. So, you know, I think it will be good company for for people in this kind of current situation. But thanks so much for joining us in this first podcast. I really want to thank James for coming on the show for this episode, and to say that if you're interested in their work, you can find out more on their website, and the links in the show notes and our own website at the address that Max gave earlier. That is www.anxious.community. So thanks a lot, James. And
thanks so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks so much. Well, that was a really illuminating conversation with James. I wanted to pick up just briefly on the final thing that he was speaking about, which is coming to a kind of peace or some sort of understanding with dealing with what I think we've been talking about as uncertainty and what he frames as the darkness. And I feel like for us, this really speaks to, on a couple of levels, to the question of anxiety, because to a very real extent, the experience of anxiety is an incapacity to cope with the uncertainty, and it can lead to a kind of frantic and let's say phobic or fearful desire for a kind of certainty, I think. But at the same time, one wouldn't want to too readily say that, because it would imply then that anxiety is just the responsibility of the individual to, make sense of the chaos of their lives. And of course, that's part of the human condition. But I also think that one of the things I appreciated James pointing towards was the role of education and the fact that this is a collective endeavor, that we have to collectively and cooperatively make sense of the uncertainty, the darkness, the chaos that is our reality, regardless of if that reality is suffused as ours is with complex technologies, or simply the chaos and confusion of human existence, and the particularities of our species.
And I agree. I think that there was a lot in that, in James's approach to the darkness that we spoke about in the end. Something about this call for resisting the urge to illuminate at all costs that darkness, that I think is a very it's very interesting for the way in which we understand people's everyday navigations of darkness, and those navigations that cause them a lot of anxiety and a lot of emotional upheaval, and it's a scary place. And so I think it's particularly important in the current moment, that is where we have where more so than in any other time, this question of this uncertainty and impossibility to offer concrete solutions to problems is really felt by so many people. I think there's something there. There's a very interesting seed in James's thinking, I think, about how we might want to approach ways forward. And as you said, I think these should be collective, and they should be just staying with what that darkness and what that uncertainty might be able to offer us. And one of the things that it might be able to offer us is changing the terms of the debate, changing the language, the constraints of our thinking for thinking about what solutions might be to. So there is something about how we can become more politically radical as well in that dark space. And yes, that's what I would keep from James's conclusions, I think.
Mm-hmm. They remind me quite a bit of some of the stuff we've been talking about in terms of the work of Cornelius Castoriadis and his sort of later work thinking through chaos. And generally the notion that the radical imagination emerges from the experience of difference, from the experience of dwelling with and considering darkness.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think, it is. And what Castoriadis does, and he has this last book that he published, which he calls A Window onto Chaos. And it's all about, in many ways, there is something about that in James's thinking, like how do we find ways to represent that chaos? That as an endeavor is a really important one. And of course, for Castoriadis, it's about how we are politically autonomous, how those representations of chaos can be our own ways of representing and not borrowed by the system. Lots of food for thought, I think.
Well, thanks again to our listeners and viewers for joining us. You can find out more about our project at anxious.community. That's http://anxious.community. This is a production of the Common Anxieties Research Project, and it's supported by the Institute for Advanced Studies at University College London and the Reimagining Value Action Lab. And we'll see you next time.
See you next time.